Hey there, Facebook world. Here we are back with the Merge Marketing Podcast live on Facebook. And today we have an exciting guest. We have Deepak Anand. Did I pronounce that correctly, Deepak?
Yes, you did.
Awesome. Nailed it. Awesome. So without further ado, we're going to be getting into talking about the cannabis industry today. Super exciting and interesting industry, especially for a lot of people out there like David and myself who are not so deep in the industry. We're really going to get a high level understanding of it today, hopefully from Deepak. So without further ado, I am going to hand over the conch to David. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thanks, Jay. I wasn't sure where you were going with that. But hello, everyone. Thank you and welcome back to the Merge Marketing Podcast. Today's episode features Mr. Deepak Anand, the CEO and director of Materia, a highly ambitious pharmaceutical company that strives to be a global leader in the cannabis industry. Deepak himself is a recognized thought leader and brings 15 years of leadership experience in the health, charitable nonprofit, and private sectors in Canada. Within the global cannabis sector, Deepak has worked with senior government officials, politicians, policymakers, health professional organizations, clinical practitioners, educators, investors, patients, as well as producers. Deepak, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me, David. I didn't know where Jay was going with the high level and if there was a pun there.
Yeah.
No pun intended. No pun intended.
I know. I was like, oh no, people are gonna think the wrong thing. But no,
high level understanding of the industry. There we go.
It's so hard with cannabis.
Yeah,
there's so many puns.
Yeah, well, hopefully we'll have a little bit more of an understanding after today, right? So,
For sure.
Deepak, I guess I just kind of want to start out before we get into the topic of today's conversation, which is going to focus primarily around the regulation of the industry. I'd just love to hear a little bit more about your story and why and how you got into the cannabis industry.
Yeah, so I come from typically a pharmaceutical industry and background, and I've done a lot of work on the regulatory side with pharmaceuticals. When Health Canada, going back almost 7 years now, was setting up a cannabis program in Canada, they had sort of, reached out and, were wondering if, there'd be many stakeholders around. And so at the time I set up an industry association. And the next thing I know, I was just flooded with patients and doctors and producers, wanting to do more, wanting to contribute more, wanting to learn more. And that's basically how I got into it. And I just saw there was so much of an interest and need and value into what was happening with cannabis that it made sense to jump into it both feet in.
Was it something that, 7 years ago? I mean, it's such a quick time frame for something to evolve so quickly. 7 years ago, when you got into the industry, what was so enticing about it? Was it more of a hobby? Did you see a huge opportunity, huge ceiling at the time? What exactly was it that inspired you to get into it?
For me, it was predominantly just the need that patients were having for medical cannabis. Just to give you some background, at the time, Canada had only legalized cannabis for medical purposes, so there was no recreational program. It wasn't even, quite frankly, on the horizon. It was a Stephen Harper government that had kind of looked at the medical side, and so quite frankly, it was more from a patient perspective. And yes, in hindsight, you're right. 7 years goes by very quickly, but we've gone in 7 years from pretty much effective prohibition to ascent progression.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing a little bit more about your background and how you got into it. You were cutting in and out a little bit there, Deepak. So it sounds like, it wasn't so much a passion you had for a long time and something you really wanted to get into, but maybe you kind of fell into it through the pharmaceutical industry that you were working in, and you saw a need because really at the time it was only for medical purposes, and then when obviously Canada opened it up to recreational use, there was a greater opportunity there.
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Perfect. Well, I mean, it's definitely fair to say that the industry as a whole is very, very complex. As Jason and I mentioned earlier, we're not experts, which is why we brought you on. And there's a lot of different ways that we could take this interview. But as I mentioned earlier, we're really going to try and focus on the regulation side of the industry, because that's for the most part your expertise. So this is going to be a really great episode for those that are potentially thinking about getting in the industry, because Deepak has a ton of knowledge that he is going to share. So I'll start it off with maybe just an overview, Deepak, of the state of the union of the cannabis industry in Canada. So what are your thoughts on where we're at right now in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, apologies. I don't know if this is any better, but what I was saying previously was quite phenomenal to see cannabis having gone from a prohibited substance to essentially really an essential service in a COVID environment. As to where the cannabis industry is today, I mean, look, on the one side, we've seen a number of growers come online. Health Canada's got over 300 licenses in Canada for people to cultivate cannabis. On the other side, depending on the province that you're in, there's clearly a number of stores. So Alberta, as an example, has done a fantastic job with over 450 stores in the first year of legalization. Ontario and BC, as examples, are ones where more stores were needed from the outset, and they're certainly ramping it up. On the flip side, if you look at it from a cost per gram perspective, we've gone down significantly compared to where we were roughly in an average of about $5 a gram, which is significantly cheaper than even where the illicit or the silver market, as most people call it, were. So prices are going down. People are starting to access cannabis more now, both for medical and recreational purposes. The system's far from perfect, right? There's still very much that needs to happen on the regulatory side, as well as on just the store rollout side. Most people typically, fail to understand that the way that we work in Canada is the federal government looks after cultivation and things that are actually grown and produced. And then the provinces decide what happens on distribution. And I think what we're seeing in the first few years of legalization is some provinces have got it right and some have got it not so right.
Yeah. Sorry, Jay, I think you're on mute.
Sorry, Deepak, what are some provinces that are have not been dealing it with the right way? What are some examples of that and some repercussions of it?
Yeah, look, so BC and Ontario both, I would say, are classic examples of not getting it right. I live in BC and I'm based here. And, by the way, nothing really changed in October of 2018 when we legalized cannabis. It was nothing different in BC. You were still able to access cannabis very freely. But if you look at it from a number of stores perspective and an access perspective, there's still a number of densely populated areas that don't have retail cannabis stores. And whether that be BC or Ontario, it's both the same example. Now, Ontario has, first of all, seen a shift in government. The government that was in charge when legalization occurred was the Kathleen Wynne government, and they had taken a certain approach towards privatization. And the Ford government then obviously got elected just in the midst of legalization and decided to change course. And I think that put Ontario back quite a bit in terms of the retail store rollout. I think what they've seen now is a clear need to have more retail stores, and Ontario is certainly well down the path to have an expanded number of stores. But really that setback has kind of affected the industry kind of more broadly, as well as not allowed the penetration to occur as deeply as it perhaps should have or could have.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So you mentioned you live in Canada, you live out in BC, so you obviously have quite a bit of knowledge of the Canadian cannabis industry and context, but your company, specifically Materia, focuses exclusively on the European market. So why is that?
Yeah, so I mean, we're basically a pharmaceutical-focused business. We saw a huge need in Europe for regulated pharmaceutical medical cannabis products, and the landscape was fairly barren in terms of the number of license holders as well as producers on that continent. And I think what we had seen in Canada was a number of lessons learned, mistakes made, and not wanting to replicate that in Europe, but actually jump off of that as a platform and move forward. The other thing Europe's done, which Canada has really not done, is I think even post-legalization, guys, in this country, I think we've let patients down post-legalization because, trying to get cannabis for medical purposes is still extremely challenging. We still tax cannabis at, which is just insane because in this country we don't tax any other medicine, yet cannabis continues to be taxed. So I think if you look at it from a pharmaceutical perspective, we haven't seen the penetration that should have occurred and actually could still occur. You can't go to a pharmacy like a Shoppers Drug Mart and pick up your prescription. You have to have it mailed to you. Whereas in Europe, it's mainstream. It's through pharmacies. They've embraced it full on. And I just feel like there's, much more of a need from a medical perspective. And that was the rationale to have set up business there. In addition to that, my background is in pharmaceuticals in Europe where I've done distribution. So I understand that landscape and, of course, have a number of connections into that whole area.
Overall, you mentioned the cost per gram is decreasing over the years, right? And I'm just sitting there trying to think, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing?
Jay, if you look at it from a federal government perspective, one of the reasons that our existing prime minister legalized cannabis was to eliminate the black market. So that was one of the central tenets of legalization, as well as make sure they took profits out of the hands of criminals. So if you look at it from a government perspective, it's definitely in their interest to drive the price down per gram. I think even from a competitive perspective, one of the biggest challenges the industry has faced is, quite frankly, getting a quality product. We keep hearing about the fact that black market cannabis is much better than the legal market. And so, when you drive the price down per gram and you put pressure on companies, they're required to make sure that they're looking at what's happening in the illicit or the black market and try and compete with that, not just on quality, but also on price. And I think if we are to drive this forward, that's the best interest of everyone involved, including the government. So I think it makes sense from that perspective.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the black market because that's kind of where I wanted to go next. Would you say that with legalization in Canada and maybe other parts of the world, it has reduced the need to turn to the black market, or do you think that it's still as strong as it was, if not more so, because of things like price and quality, which you just referenced?
Yeah, I think it depends on which pockets in different areas. And I think what we're seeing generally, there seems to have been a decrease. No one was expecting the black market to be gone on October 17th of 2018, which they legalized cannabis. So, that was, if anyone was expecting that was almost naive of them to do. We still have a black market for alcohol in this country, whether, and it's been legalized for a very long time. So I don't think that was really the objective. I think the interest was to bring the numbers down. I think as you see more retail store penetration, as you see stores come online, you will start to see dissipating of the black market, and certainly areas that have a number of retail stores, whether it be the GTA or the Toronto area, or Calgary, Edmonton, or Vancouver, where there are a number of stores, you are starting to see that decrease. You're not seeing a decrease, which in my blocking cannabis stores, you're going to basically, ensure the black market disappears. In fact, it's quite the opposite. You're taking it from a storefront operation that you can regulate and tax and actually putting it into back alleys. And you're not addressing the issue as much as you think you are. So I think that, governments are starting to come on board with this and realize the need for it. Police departments, and of course, a very timely conversation for all of that now. But they're realizing that, this is something that, they'd like to see in the mainstream versus in back alleys. So I think all of that goes to say, people are smartening up. One of the things that we've been able to do with legalization is actually have a conversation about what we should be doing. Because, before that, everything was taboo. Everything was banned. No police chief wanted to engage in it. No mayor wanted to talk about it. No, provincial leader wanted to talk about it. But now we can have these serious conversations.
We can't go and the entire podcast without talking about what the podcast is essentially about, which is marketing, right? And I think it really is in line with exactly what you're talking about right now, Deepak, is, with this social accepting of cannabis, but still you have it very archaic in the way that it's that the policies are written on platforms like Facebook and Instagram and things like that. So how do you think, or how do you see it evolving? Do you see it evolving quickly, or is it always going to be be like this, where we're going to have this red tape every time we try to promote CBD or cannabis on social media?
Yeah, Jay, it's a quite a timely question, actually. Facebook, as an example, is doing a consultation at the moment to understand how they should look at regulating CBD. And I've been fortunate enough to be part of that group where they've had conversations with stakeholders, just kind of figuring out how to regulate it. And the people at Facebook had kind of said, we're going to take a one-size-fits-all approach. And, it's federally illegal in the U.S. And, there's a farm bill that's now legalizing things on a state-by-state basis. So what if we took the approach on Facebook? And that's not going to work, right? I mean, just the way that cannabis legislation and regulations have evolved globally is it's very much a patchwork of regulations. One size does not fit all. You need to have a separate set of regulations for each area that you kind of get involved with. Having said that, entities like Snapchat, an example, have realized the opportunity in the business. And what they've been is more proactive and said, all right, we know this is going to be something that is going to people are going to spend a lot of ad dollars towards. How do we make sure we embrace it and set regulations on a country by country, sort of perspective for it? So we've got a Canadian cannabis kind of marketing association working group that actually has a lot of consultations with these entities. But basically, I mean, you're going to have to try and get products out in front of as many people as you can. Unfortunately, in Canada, there's very little that you can do from an advertising perspective. There's very little you can say and see. And there's not much difference between CBD and THC. In fact, there's no difference between THC and CBD. So there are other areas like Europe where CBD is everywhere. And I think that, Facebook and some of these other groups are looking very seriously about how they could, sort of penetrate and target that area. But it's very, very early days. But we are seeing interest. And I think in a post-COVID, post-recession environment, you're going to see a lot more of these groups pay very close attention to cannabis because it's going to be a solid revenue generator and income stream for them.
I think that, it was only maybe a year ago when it seemed like everybody and their brother was hopping on the CBD train, coming out with their own brand and their own product. And obviously they had the frustration with Facebook and those platforms to advertise it. So, in your opinion, what are some of the best avenues right now today to market your branded CBD product?
Jay, it really depends where you are. I mean, if you're in Canada, as an example, I don't care where you are, there's literally no options. I mean, there's very little you can actually say and do. If you're in Europe, as an example, and that's, again, one of the reasons why I decided to go to Europe was, we can have an e-commerce website. We can actually go to retailers. Like, we can get into like a Harrods or a Boots, which is like a Shoppers Drug Mart or a Nordstrom, and start to carry our products within them, which is quite a shift. And again, that was the reason why we decided to go to Europe. But if you're in Canada, you want to work within the regulations. You want to understand what the regulations are doing and saying. And we've seen some creative things come up, right? We've seen Canopy partner up with Seth Rogen, as an example, as well as, Snoop Dogg and a few bigger celebrities to work within the regulations around endorsing, the products and also sort of, putting their name behind products. Now, that's a very fine line in terms of what Health Canada allows and doesn't allow. And there are a number of companies that are in the space right now that are, skirting the regulations, let's just say, around what happens. And Health Canada hasn't really come down and enforced a lot of things, but there's a little bit of wiggle room. And I think the industry is like any industry, kind of figuring out how to work around the regulations and do something within it. And I think so far what we've seen is the bigger companies be quite successful in terms of what they've decided to embark on from a marketing and advertising perspective.
Offers an amazing opportunity for any sort of influencers out there right now, as they have all the leverage.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially including the U.S., because, we're federally legal in this country. That changes the conversation. So if you're a Martha Stewart or you're a Jay-Z or you're a Beyonce, you can get behind an industry that isn't necessarily going to criminally prosecute you in the U.S. because it's been offside of federal right. A lot of money coming to Canada because if you're you can't list on a U.S. exchange or couldn't list on a U.S. exchange previously, whereas you could in Canada because it was federally legal. So and then the other side is the whole celebrity side is you can endorse a brand in Canada because it's not illegal. It's perfectly permitted within the regulations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that is really great insights into marketing because I know, Jason and I at our agency, we've hit some roadblocks with Facebook and some of the other platforms when trying to advertise this stuff. And like you said, there's just basically no options. Influencer marketing right now is obviously the big one, and I guess kind of moving into the final parts of the interview. From just an overall business perspective, what would your advice be to someone that's looking to get into the cannabis business or the cannabis industry? And I know there's a lot of people out there, Jay mentioned earlier, that kind of wanted to jump on the bandwagon and come out with a brand. And I think it's probably safe to say that they were all doing it for maybe a lot of the wrong reasons, because maybe they like to engage in some cannabis products and thought, this will be cool, I'll get into the business and it'll be easy and I'll get to enjoy my own product. But really, it's probably not like that. So what would your advice be?
Yeah, David, that's a great question. So I think what we're seeing right now is and we're seeing this now in the quote unquote psychedelic space where people seem to be jumping on the bandwagon. And this is very early cannabis, where, people are just getting into it because you could raise money as long as you had a plan on a paper. You could raise a whole bunch of money and basically start to then figure out what you're actually going to do as a business once you've got that money. That's the wrong way to be looking at things. I don't care what business you're running. You need to actually sit down and understand what's your business plan. Sure, you're going to make some assumptions. There's always going to be assumptions. But still, to a great extent, you need to understand what your monthly burn rate is going to be, how much capital you're going to need to deploy, what's your income, like where is your money actually going to be coming in from, and when is it going to come in? So I think gone are the days where just because you had a license and Health Canada was issuing licenses, you would then apply. And that was the mentality of a lot of early stage companies, which, by the way, now we're seeing go bankrupt. I think 2020 is going to be the year where, expedited by COVID, you're going to see a number of bankruptcies come on stream. We've already started to see them in the Canadian cannabis industry, and we're not done by any stretch of the imagination. And I think all that translates back to not having a plan, not having a solid, sort of business idea that you can execute, and overpaying your staff. I think that's the other element. We've seen that salaries for CEOs in the cannabis industry have been absolutely insane for an industry that's not making much money. And so you got to be careful when you look at those things as a startup and kind of balance all of those different aspects.
That's great advice. I hope that really helps some people out there thinking of maybe getting into it, because it's a fun and exciting industry, or so it is perceived. But Jay, you got any final thoughts that you wanna ask?
I'm just glad we had Deepak on today's episode to kind of dive deep into this. I know it's a topic that we've had a lot of discussions about with clients and the barriers and challenges that they face in the industry. And I think Deepak definitely provided some clarity today.
100%. So Deepak, thanks a lot for joining us today. For anybody listening that wants to maybe connect with you and find out more about what you do, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, Twitter, usually _ Deepak Anand. I'm pretty active on Twitter, so that'd be the best way to communicate.
Perfect. Well, thank you again. And we do like to end our episodes with the same question for everybody. So our final question of the day is, if you could choose one person, dead or alive, who would it be and why, to represent your brand?
Repeat the question one more time.
Yeah, no problem. So we ask all of our guests the same question at the end, and that is, if you could choose one person, dead or alive, to represent you or your brand, who would it be and why?
Wow. Probably Gandhi.
Gandhi. Why is that?
Well, I just, his whole principles of kind of self-discipline and ethics and morals have been, fairly sort of astounding in the way that he's gone about approaching things on the Indian side of the subcontinent. I've, firsthand sort of, seen a lot of those kind of things, filter through and come back. So I feel like, in a world of today, you need to be having that sort of a mentality.
Awesome.
Love
That's
it.
great. Yeah, love it. Okay, Deepak, thank you very much again for your time today. We appreciate everything, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks for having me.
All right.
Awesome. So there you go. Deepak Anand talking about cannabis. He's got quite the resume in the cannabis industry. And did he inspire you to start David Stubbe's CBD or what?
Yeah, you know what? He may have a little bit. I'm not a big consumer, so if I'm going to get into the industry, it's going to be for probably the right reasons, I would think.
Yeah, I just know that the market, it just seemed like there was a point in time when the market became very, very saturated.
Yeah.
CBD oils and products. And as you know, we've had experience working with them ourselves, and we had to overcome humps and challenges in getting approval. And there are certain ways to advertise it. You just can't be so blatant and send social media traffic to a landing page that sells CBD. You have to think outside of the box and be more than just a CBD brand. You got to be more of a wellness brand, for example, and pick that target audience. For example, if it's women 45 to 60 years old, then you build up this entire brand being a media source for, wellness for women 45 to 60. And CBD, the fact that you have a CBD oil that you want to promote is more of an afterthought.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That I believe is the approach. And like we talked about, and like Deepak was mentioning, you got your Snoop Dogg's and your Seth Rogen's who are piggybacking with brands, and brands are taking that opportunity to align themselves with these big names because you immediately got exposure to 1, 2, 3 million people on Instagram through Snoop Dogg. You know what I mean? So it's just such an opportunity for influencers. I truly believe that if you're an influencer in that space, you have a lot of leverage right now.
Absolutely. I mean, it's probably really the only way to go, the only good way to go. And it's funny, when I asked that last question to Deepak about who he would want to have represent his brand, I'm surprised he didn't say Snoop Dogg. But
Gandhi doesn't have the same social pull that a Seth Rogen or Snoop Dogg does. Not anymore, at least. If they had social back then, they probably would have a lot of pull.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? So, I mean, hopefully that's pretty cool that Deepak's actually in conversation with Facebook, or at least in some way involved in the process of figuring out how we can advertise this stuff or what we can and cannot do. And I think that's the frustrating part is we can't really do anything right now. And a lot of these products don't necessarily even have THC in it. They're drug free, like CBD. It's good for muscle, joint pain, whatever it might be. So it's too bad because there's a lot of great products out there that it'd be nice to help.
Yeah, it sucks. It is pigeonholed, right? And I mean that it makes it tough for a platform like look, comparing Facebook, and it's good to hear platforms like Snapchat are being a little more open to it when they're making individual regulations within certain areas. But for a platform like Facebook, it does make it easy, for them just to put a blanket over everything. Underage 18 is underage, right? 18 is the limit for any sort of content you want to do. If it's sexual content, it needs to be 18 plus. Alcohol content, I believe alcohol content as well is 18 plus. I believe so. I don't think they segmented it so in the US you can only advertise alcohol to 21 plus. I think you can. Yeah. I think you can still do 18 plus, but they just almost have their own governing law of Facebook that applies to the world. You know what I mean? So it's really not their business model to go into the Netherlands and be like, well, cannabis is accepted here and it's legal, so we're going to make cannabis advertising okay in the Netherlands. You know what I mean? It's just, it's good to hear that they're progressing, but I'd be interested to see where this goes in the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah, same. I would think that with everything going on right now, that the speed of change that companies like Facebook have been making is impressive. I'm sure this isn't top on their list, but maybe, and who knows? Maybe we'll see something happen faster than we think.
Cool. Awesome.
Okay, everyone. Well, thanks a lot for listening in to yet another episode of the Merge Marketing Podcast. Please be sure to rate, subscribe to our podcast. We would love to have you back for future episodes. All right.
We'll catch you next time. See you later, Facebook.
See ya.
Late.